Okay, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Horan. I have 1 o'clock on the dot. And so welcome to the 7th installment in our 12-part series, Forest for the Birds, Conserving America's Forest Birds webinar series. Today, we will be hearing from Amanda Mahaffey of the Forest Stewards Guild on Forestry for the Birds, about conservation initiatives to benefit forest birds in various states. Now I'm going to turn it over to our National Conservation Training Center host, Shannon Connors, to go over some webinar logistics. Go ahead, Shannon.
Thanks, Jeff. So first off, the Forest for the Birds, Conserving America's Forest Birds webinar series is jointly sponsored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center, Forest Ecology Working Group, and Migratory Bird Program. We will share this contact information in the chat box if you're interested in learning more about the Forest Ecology Working Group or if you'd like to receive continuing education credits for attending these webinars. And now just a quick disclaimer. This product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. So to introduce Amanda Mahaffey and give us a little bit more information on this webinar series, I'm going to turn it back to Jeff Horan from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you to NCTC and the Migratory Birds Program, who has worked with our Forest Ecology Working Group to make this series happen. And again, the purpose of the webinar series and the Forest Ecology Working Group is to increase the understanding and integration of forest ecology, applied science, and habitat management principles within the Fish and Wildlife Service and also with our many partners. The Migratory Bird Program is pleased to be co-sponsoring this webinar series as part of the Partners in Flight program, celebrating 30 years of conservation, and also the sobering recognition of the loss of 3 billion birds over the last 50 years. So there is still much conservation work to do, and this is part of that roadmap to recovery. And as Shannon mentioned earlier, if you have questions about the webinar series, you can, or our Forest Ecology Working Group, you can contact me. If you, and my information, contact information is in the flyers for this, as well as you can also contact Jim Siegel with NCTC, especially if you need credits for the Wildlife Society or Society of American Foresters. So before I introduce Amanda, I need to mention just a few more things. As Shannon mentioned, we are trying to engage you as participants by taking questions during the course of today's presentation. So Amanda's going to stop about halfway through her presentation, and we'll take a question or two then that I will choose from the group. And then finally, at the end of the presentation, we'll have a chance for more questions. And if there are, and we also have been trying to then send out, for the questions we were not able to answer, we send those answers to those questions out to our participants in the next few weeks. So finally, last thing is, before I introduce Amanda, is to run through a commercial for our next month's webinar series. And so next month, we'll still be talking about conservation initiatives. We've talked about the loss of 3 billion birds. We've talked about landscape scale conservation. We've talked about ecological factors impacting birds, and we've gotten down into stand dynamics. But now we're really going to be talking about conservation initiatives to help solve these problems. And so next month, and that's October 19th, we're going to be talking about bird conservation on private forest lands. And our speakers are Darren Sleep from the Sustainable Forest Initiative and Darren Miller from the Ecology. So now to introduce Amanda Mahaffey. Amanda serves as Deputy Director of the Forest Stewards Guild, a national nonprofit that practices and promotes ecological forestry to sustain the integrity of the forest ecosystem and human communities that depend upon it. I've had the privilege of working with Amanda on a number of work groups, trainings, and actions. She does a great job of connecting forest stewards in the areas of forest climate adaptation, fire science, and management, and elevating women's voices in forest stewardship. Amanda and the Forest Stewards Guild have supported the spread of Foresters for the Birds to states across the country. So please welcome Amanda Mahaffey, Deputy Director of the Forest Stewards Guild, Forest for the Birds. Tell us some more bird stories, Amanda. Thank you.
Thanks a bunch, Jeff. While I'm getting permission to share, I just want to say I've been peeking at the attendee list, and I know we're all still in a digital world here, but I see 330 people and counting on here. I see a lot of familiar names, and I see a lot of unfamiliar names. So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about this program. Some of you will be very familiar with Foresters for the Birds. Others might be hearing about it for the first time, or you might not be aware of how it operates in different parts of the country. I'm going to give my best to provide an overview during the next hour of the webinar and allow time for questions. I apologize if I misrepresent anything that other folks have put together, but I will do my best to answer questions. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this program. So Jeff mentioned I work for the Forest Stewards Guild. We are a nonprofit, and we have members that work across the country in promoting and practicing ecological forestry, which absolutely includes forest birds as part of what makes an ecosystem function. Our role as an organization is often in connecting and convening and facilitating connections and partnerships between different agencies, state, federal, local, municipal, county, and organizations, nonprofits, businesses, and others that are working to advance forest stewardship across the landscape. So we're not the ones who came up with Foresters for the Birds, but we are absolutely major champions of it in spreading it, and I'll talk about its origins in just a moment. As Jeff mentioned in this series, the first part of this series was about setting the stage. Then there were several great presentations on conservation design that get you from kind of the landscape level down to the stand level. This segment today kicks off the part on conservation initiatives, and so I'm going to be talking a little bit more about people and a little bit less about birds. So I apologize if you're hoping to talk mostly about birds today, but people are a very important part of the equation and a very important part of making forest bird conservation happen on the landscape. And I hope that my presentation and the others in this segment will help set us up for the conservation action segment in this series. I'd like to make a brief acknowledgement that most of us on the webinar today are not the original stewards of the forests and the birds that we are talking about. As we are hopefully aware, Indigenous peoples across these lands have been stewarding forests, birds, wildlife since time immemorial. So wherever you are, everyone, I hope you can just take a moment and acknowledge the people who have come before us. And hopefully that we can work together as a community, as a thinking community, to advance these ecological principles and really keep these forests intact for the future, for the birds and for the people. Today, I have three major parts to my talk. First, I'm going to go through kind of a brief history of the program of Foresters for the Birds. I'm going to outline some elements of success in the program, and that's kind of the crux of it. I will pause for questions after that section, and then I'll dive into some examples, excuse me, of highlights from across the landscape. So unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about every state's programs, but I'll give you some highlights of what works well in different landscapes. So first, history of the program. Foresters for the Birds was launched in 2008 by Audubon, Vermont, and the Vermont Department of Forests, Parks, and Recreation. Their goal, as you could see from their website, is integrating timber and songbird habitat management. So it really, from the beginning, part of the success of this program has been that intentional pairing of Audubon, having a bird-focused organization and a forestry organization as major champions of it. And timber is part of the equation. So integrating timber, forest management, and songbird habitat. These maps should look familiar to many of the folks on this webinar, I would imagine. On the left, of course, you see the flyways, and Audubon Vermont noticed, of course, their role, or kind of Vermont's role in the Atlantic flyway, and that there's as I understand, there's an Atlantic flyway kind of program within the National Audubon program. And on the right, you see another hopefully familiar map of the forest bird species richness from breeding bird survey routes. I know the map is a little bit outdated at this point, but the red really, really highlights the importance of these northern forests. For the folks at Audubon, Vermont, what really stood out to them was the red that you see in Vermont. And other states, as you'll hear, have picked up on this as well. And we really see not only an opportunity, but a responsibility to better steward these forests to benefit forest birds and the people that are part of these forest communities as well. From Audubon Vermont's website, but they say it really well, and they're the folks that came up with it, we envision healthy forests, so healthy forests come first, that provide suitable breeding and post-breeding habitat conditions for a suite of priority birds and sustained yields of timber and other forest products and services along the Atlantic Flyway. I'll let you read that just again for just a moment. So it's a pretty broad vision, but it's a really nice one to focus on when you're spending time in workshops like the one you see pictured at right. So what does this look like? Well, as I mentioned, people are a big part of the equation. Healthy forests require foresters. It also requires landowners who care about forest bird habitat. And to make the boots on the ground work happen, you need to have loggers that understand and believe in the work that they are doing, where the rubber literally hits the logging road. So in order to have sustainable timber markets, healthy forests, and forest bird habitat, you have to engage these communities of people. So as I describe the kind of elements of success, it's going to have a kind of a people focus. So here is the magic formula as I have distilled it, but anybody can argue with me or add your own. But the first ingredient on the left, wildlife biologists and foresters and loggers and landowners need to work together to achieve that vision that Audubon Vermont first outlined. And don't worry, I am going to talk about other states' programs, but Audubon Vermont and Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation began this, and their vision really still holds true across these different landscapes. So the partnerships between these different people groups, biologists, foresters, loggers, landowners, really needs to be at the forefront to make any kind of a change in what happens on the landscape. The next ingredient is the intentional pairing of forest habitat and silviculture. So, sometimes landowners will come to a workshop and they might say, oh, well, why can't I just leave the forest alone? Or can I just clean this up? And the response is, yes, that will be good for some birds, but if you do this with intentionality, then you can enhance forest bird habitat on a local scale and on the landscape scale by really expanding that vision across your property and across neighboring properties. And so it's really by pairing the forest habitat associations with silviculture intentionally, so with intentionality that enables you to make a meaningful difference. Also impactful communication tools, and I'll get into those in a moment, but again, the people element, communication is really critical to affecting folks' behavior and changing what happens on the landscape. And last but not least, you need implementation. You need to have bird-friendly forestry practices which result from all of these other ingredients. I couldn't resist throwing in an Aldo Leopold quote here, where he references the minds of the thinking community. So the thinking community, I think, drives home what we need to see in order to achieve this kind of landscape scale bird conservation on the ground. So the first element is these printed materials. There are websites which Shannon may be able to drop into the chat box. They're in the notes of my presentation as well. And you can also search on different Audubon's websites to get these. But Audubon Vermont started with a few guides, and other states have followed suit. But having printed materials is really helpful for reaching those different audiences and enabling them to see what the goal is and how we can get there. Audubon Vermont began with this Birder's Dozen, and for the birders out there, I'm sure several of these are going to look very familiar. I wanted to highlight some of the key things about those birds, and I'm glad I wasn't in the midst of these very rigorous discussions, but the birds that were identified in Audubon Vermont and Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation's Birder's Dozen are birds that have populations in decline. They also, or they have another conservation need. These are also birds that are easy to identify by sight and sound, which is really important if you're trying to engage forest landowners. You might not always get to see a black-throated blue warbler, but you might, if you can learn to hear it, then you'll begin to care about the forest that it lives in. And these are also birds that represent different niches in the ecological landscape. So in Vermont, it began with focusing on kind of the northern hardwood forest. But as this program has expanded to other places, as I'll describe, then thinking about different forest types, northern softwoods, oak pine forests, riparian areas, that's also been really important in making sure that the suite of birds speaks to the people that are hopefully going to be stewarding them, and also makes sense scientifically. So again, this is kind of the key dozen that Audubon Vermont and Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation began with. But these birds represent a series, kind of a suite of birds that benefit from management with birds in mind. And of course, other species of wildlife also benefit when you manage with birds in mind. Another key element of engaging a thinking community is workshops. I know a forester in New Jersey, Bill Zipsey, who says that change happens in residences. So every time you have a workshop, you educate some foresters and get us on board with these ideas of seeing the forest from the bird's perspective. I go to logger workshops and teach them about some of these basic principles. And if they get out of the skidder, they have a chance to see the forest a little bit differently from where their machinery is hitting the ground. Woodland owners are highly engaged. They tend to really love these workshops and talking with a real live forester and a real live ornithologist. And land trusts, especially in the Northeast, I've found have been a growing audience of people that are looking for these kinds of resources and information. They want to better understand the forest as part of their conservation landscape and how they can better steward them. Technical assistance. So Audubon, Connecticut, for instance, and also Vermont and others provide technical assistance in the forms of habitat assessments where a biologist can go out on your land with you. They'll review a forest management plan and can add on an addendum or something that just makes your forest management plan have an element of bird-friendly forestry in it. And they'll also consult if you're going to have a timber harvest. I think that, as I understand, the program in Vermont had grown to the point where they could only, after a while, only accept larger acreages because there was such demand for someone to come out on their land and talk with them about what's this timber harvest going to look like for the birds on my property. Another key way to engage folks is through demonstration areas. So on the left is the newly retired Andy Schultz from the Maine Forest Service using a QR code at a land trust site that manages with birds in mind. In the bottom right, there's a map from the Green Mountain Audubon Center in Vermont. And I wanted to point this out as kind of a teaser because they've also been thinking about climate change and climate adaptation. You can see a whole other webinar on that, and I could probably share the link with you later, but they've been thinking about climate change and how that's impacting birds and also how that impacts their forest management. So again, these demonstration areas are a great way to engage people, landowners, foresters, loggers, in thinking about the forest from the bird's perspective and thinking toward the future. Vermont, of course, has maple syrup, and I am not going to get into any debates with anybody on this webinar about who has the best maple syrup. I will just point out that that they've been using this as another avenue for reaching people. So, bird-friendly habitats, bird-friendly maple products is another way to engage landowners, private landowners, in thinking about the forest from the bird's perspective. So with that, I will pause. And Jeff, if you can read any questions that might have popped up, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Thanks, Amanda. And so far you're doing great. And so there are questions in the chat. And so one question right up front from Nick is, what metrics are being used to measure success of the Forestry for the Birds program, and how are we doing?
That is a really great question. So as I will talk about in a little bit, the program has grown and expanded. Again, when Audubon Vermont started in 2008, they only had kind of one core piece of funding. They didn't know that the program was going to last 11 years and grow and expand the way it has. So the metrics have changed, and the metrics change and vary depending on the state and depending on the funding source So for example, if there's a program, like a funding program that offers technical assistance, then they're measuring how many landowners have been reached or how many landowners have implemented a forest management plan that involves bird-friendly forestry practices. But when you look at it across the landscape, I think it's actually kind of hard to answer that clearly and succinctly with numbers. I think that the metrics I would like to use is kind of the change in culture. So how many people are thinking differently about the forest? How many people are making different decisions with boots on the ground because of what they've learned about seeing the forest from the bird's perspective? It's really hard right now to quantify in acres. For those of you that work with NRCS and other cost share programs, that obviously the pandemic has put a damper on getting things done in a timely manner. So, you can apply 1 year and hope to have a prescription implemented. And then, gosh, we have climate change, we have flooding, we have hurricanes, and then the logger can't get out for another year. So in terms of measuring success and measuring acres of implementation, I feel like at this point, those aren't the best metrics to really talk about success. And again, this is a long-term prospect. So while in the short term, a timber harvest might change forest bird habitat for a few years, it might take a few years to get to kind of the ideal conditions, to get the regeneration that you want, to get the conditions that you need for birds to move in, the desired bird species to move in and really take advantage of the changes. So there's time as another factor that makes it challenging to really measure what is the change and what's been the impact. I was trying to look up a few years ago, Audubon, Vermont did talk about the impact and had some metrics, and I can't find that paper anymore, and it's probably a few years outdated, but it really just struck me that the program has grown so much from its origins that I honestly don't know how to best quantify that impact. And I don't know that numbers would do it. So I'm sorry that might not be a satisfactory answer, but that's the truth of it from my view.
No, great. So thanks, Amanda. I'm going to let you get back to your presentation in just a second, but this question goes so nicely along with that. Again, you could look back to the PIF BCR plans and stuff and come up with population metrics, but really maybe it is about something else. And so this question is from Julie Lynn, and it's more of a social scientist kind of question. And it's, how important is it to know the landowners before developing these programs? And so she stands specifically in terms of demographics, values, needs, etc.
Very much so. When I go into the next section and talk about examples from different places, I'll try to get into that in a little greater detail. But I will say that the National Woodland Owners Survey data and the Tools for Engaging Landowners Effectively, or TELE program, has definitely been instrumental in a number of these programs in developing the kind of the messaging and in understanding the audience and using targeted marketing tools to really reach the audience in effective ways by really understanding what their needs are, what their concerns are, and using this program to help answer questions that they might not have even known that they wanted to ask. But once they meet a bird and they want to know more about him or her, usually him because they're brighter and more colorful, then it's a great entree to get those landowners engaged and learning a lot more and getting engaged in taking action on the ground.
All right, keep rolling, Amanda. Thank you.
Okay. And again, I can't see the questions from my one screen right now, but I look forward to answering more in a little bit. So in this next section, I want to share some highlights from across the landscape. To my knowledge, these are places where there are existing or budding programs that have grown out of Vermont's program on Foresters for the Birds. Again, I don't have time to talk in great detail about all of them, and I don't have contact info for every single person, but I probably know someone who does. But I'm going to highlight a few from different parts of the country. I'll talk about Maine, which I am most familiar with. I will mention North Carolina. Also, Michigan has a great program, and Oregon has a budding program. So those are also sort of in the order of how long they've been around. So welcome to Maine. So first of all, in Maine, we decided to call the program, instead of Foresters for the Birds, we decided to call it Forestry for Maine birds. And this might get to the question we just had about audiences. So again, in thinking about foresters, it's not just about Foresters for the Birds, it's also about the landowners, and it's also about the loggers. So if we just call it Foresters for the Birds, then we might have made a couple of audiences feel left out. So, and anyhow, when we were bringing the program over to Maine, which began in about 2013, we decided to call it Forestry for Maine Birds to help those audiences identify with our geography of Maine as a state, and also with the practice of forestry, which is one of our major industries. Let's see. So here's a quick photo from a recent workshop from this summer. Sally Stockwell from Maine Audubon Society and I got to give a workshop at the Mahoosic Land Trust. So this particular shot was in oak pine habitat in Western Maine, and it was really wonderful to be out with a bunch of conservation-minded landowners. And this is one of the few properties that they have that is being actively managed, but this land trust is very interesting because they're thinking about things from the landscape scale. They've evolved to where they really have targeted properties that they want to conserve, and they're thinking about how to manage it with forest birds in mind, and of course, having people be able to enjoy those forests. So just a little snapshot of Maine. I want to dive into a little bit greater detail on some of the materials that we offer in Maine. So first, you'll see a couple of our birds, a couple of our 20 priority bird species. The little circles in the middle, OP stands for oak pine. So, and these are separate pages for ovenbird and for wood thrush. So these circles indicate that you are more likely to find ovenbird in oak pine. NH is northern hardwood, and M is northern mixedwood. And you might find ovenbird in northern softwood, but not as likely. Similarly for wood thrush, oak pine and northern hardwood, you're more likely to find wood thrush. You might find it in northern mixedwood, and you're not so likely to find it in northern softwood forest. So those little circles kind of indicate our major forest habitat associations. And similarly, the circles on the bottom indicate older, intermediate, or younger forest, and how likely you are to find that particular bird in that habitat feature. This is part of our something like 140-page guide, but it's not crazy big. It's kind of it's small enough to fit in a cruiser vest pocket. And they're really, really fun. So this is from the Forester's Guide with a lot of detail. We also have a landowner guide and a logger guide, and other images and items that you'll see here. You know, of course, there's how to identify the bird, a bit about the nest, the food, the territory size. And we also put down some info about the desired forest condition. So in Maine, one of the key things that we decided to do, instead of saying, if you do silvicultural prescription X, you will get bird Y, we felt that it would be better received if instead we talked about what's the desired forest condition. There are foresters that will say, well, don't tell me what to do, but if you show me what you want me to do, I can do that. So we talked about the desired forest condition for these different forest songbirds. And then the graphic on the bottom helps you know where to look for the bird and also where it likes to build its nest and a little bit of info about kind of the forest type. So, and this also just shows an example from another couple of pages in the guide about the information that we provide about the forest that we are looking at. We would love to see more older, well-managed forests in Maine. And there are places where younger forests might be more appropriate, but it's all a balance, trying to find that balance across the public and private ownerships with their different management histories across the landscape. This is an example slide from one of the presentations that we like to give for loggers. Sorry, I did see sorry, I am seeing some of the questions pop up. There are, if you look on the Maine Audubon website, then you can download these guides in PDF. So it's I think it's maineaudubon.org/FFMB for Forestry for Maine Birds. And I know that our counterparts in other states have resources available as well. Sorry, back to this slide. So in presenting with loggers or giving presentations to loggers, then I need to make sure that I'm speaking their language. So thinking, if you're thinking about a yellow-bellied sapsucker, for instance, then I can talk about, well, what can loggers do about these birds? So, retaining and recruiting snags and decaying trees where it is operationally safe to do so. When you're thinking about snags, well, if you have logger's choice on a land that you're working on, which is another discussion, then, aim for at least 6 per acre, and the bigger the better. If you can leave felled snags in place, that's great to do. And think about recruitment snags, for future wood. If you're thinking about the yellow-bellied sapsucker, then these are some things that loggers can do operationally to help enhance that habitat. So again, this is just an example slide from logger workshops in Maine. Now we're going to go to North Carolina. which I very fortunately got to visit last month for a mostly outdoor workshop. So in North Carolina, they have different sources of funding and different focus, and they call their program the Forest Landbird Legacy Program. They have a really great team of people working across North Carolina, from the mountains to the Piedmont to the coastal plain. And within the Forest Landbird Legacy Program, they have some priority forest blocks and areas where they target their outreach to landowners and to foresters that are working in those areas. Again, to try to have that really targeted geographic impact and impact in the different forest types. So one example, this is a photo from from a 2018 workshop held in the coastal plain. It was a bottomland hardwoods workshop, and it was co-sponsored, talking about private landowners. It was co-sponsored by Enviva, which is a pellet company. So they are doing what they can to put the forest first, while making a living in managing for pellets as an energy saving wood product. That's again a whole other discussion on how you feel about that, but it was great for them to be part of this workshop, and they are really trying to conserve bottomland hardwood forests in the regions that are in their wood basket. So this workshop was an opportunity to bring together some folks that are very against cutting trees with people who are very pro cutting trees, with biologists, and just kicking the same dirt, looking at the same trees, and talking about what different kinds of silviculture mean on the in the bottomland hardwood forest landscape. So it was really nice to be able to partner with Audubon, North Carolina, and Enviva in offering this workshop to bring folks together and start getting on the same page about what does this look like, and hopefully realize that it doesn't have to be all that divisive and different. Birds are a nice poster child for doing this. This is a photo from last month. Audubon, North Carolina, out in the mountains, has a golden wing warbler project. So this is from a conservation property with a very different setting than the Bottomlands workshop that I just showed you. It was really great to get together and see this as kind of a demonstration area and talk with the conservation partners and what it took to make this happen in the mountainous landscape, which looks very different from the Bottomlands. So zooming on, Michigan. So Forestry for Michigan Birds is a growing program, and they got a grant from the U.S. Forest Service to really launch their program, and they have a really great suite of partners. I managed to talk with them and share some insights from Maine. These are their slides, not mine, but when they were thinking about forest habitat associations, Michigan is not all that different from Maine in terms of forest types. Generally speaking, our trees behave differently, but there are a lot of similar trees. And also we have a similar mix of industry, forest industry, large industrial, and with smaller private ownerships. As you move further west into the Lake States, then there's more public land as well. And so engaging public partners becomes increasingly important. But you can see, just as an example from this slide, they were looking at a hardwoods association, mixed wood, softwood, and also oak pine. And to pair this, to put it in forester terms, instead of just what the birds might read, then they paired it with the SAF, Society of American Foresters, forest types. So a forester reading this can understand what's going on, and someone with a bird background could read it and also be literally on the same page. So they borrowed some of our approach from Maine in building Michigan's program. Again, I was glad to not be in the room when people were fighting over which were going to be their priority bird species, but this graphic shows kind of a nice summary of where they landed. And you can see, as they were thinking about overstory, midstory, and understory, and thinking about softwoods, mixedwoods, and hardwoods, where did these different birds fall out? Which birds would speak to different people that might own land or manage land in these different forest types and forest habitat associations? What birds really tell that story? So I really like this graphic. I'll need to find the URL to share with you for Forestry for Michigan Birds, but they're doing a really nice job building a program, developing materials, and they're on the cusp of producing their guidebook. The Guild is helping with some of the graphics as well. I see a note from Katie. So yes, way to go, Michigan. And I'm really glad that we get to help share this information and just what's worked well in our landscape that can help you advance the similar goals in Michigan's landscape. Okay, Oregon. So this is another different title. So in Oregon, Forestry for the Birds, with a colon, and Western Oregon. So with this one, again, the funding source and the target audience are a little bit different. We would have loved to have the funding and the focus to support a statewide program for Oregon that really hits the west side of the Cascades, as well as the east side of the Cascades. But for one, as many of you are probably familiar, it's a very different landscape. And also then we need to think about, well, what about Washington? What about Northern California? So with the funding source that we had, that we are still working with, and I say we, this is actually the Forest Stewards Guild that's gotten a grant from a soil and water conservation district. So we're building our base in that area and trying to expand. So right now it says Forestry for the Birds, Western Oregon, but hopefully someday we'll be able to add another edition for the east side. So in Oregon, these are very different challenges than you would see in North Carolina or in Michigan or in Maine. The crux of it is still reaching private landowners and trying to engage them in forest stewardship and forest management that might be a little bit different from what's traditionally practiced in that landscape. Really, this kind of circle of engagement starts with identifying what does the landowner want from his or her land. What's there? What do you have to work with? What do you collectively want the future condition of the forest to be? And then based on that, you can adjust or modify your plan to bring in an element of bird-friendly forestry practices, and integrate that into the stewardship actions. So it's sort of a cycle of thinking, of engaging those landowners. And on the right, you see kind of a graphic that outlines some of the forest type challenges that you see just on the west side in terms of the seral stages of different conifers. And how do you represent that? How do you talk with landowners that live on the coast and get them to care about what happens in the mountains and vice versa? So it's a different can of worms. Sorry, bad pun. But it's good to be part of that discussion. This is another from our draft guide. It's in progress, but this graphic depicts other elements that we're trying to highlight in Oregon's landscape as well. So again, having graphics that speak to the local audience, that highlight structural variability, snags, different riparian habitat, kind of the key landscape features that those birds are keying into. So more to come. We're working on the guide. We have drafts being circulated among partners right now. But this is in progress for Oregon. We also were able to have a workshop in July outdoors on a landowner's property. So if you couldn't see the topography difference before, you can kind of see it in this photo. But it really just underscores the difference in the challenges of implementing a program like Foresters to the Birds in different landscapes and engaging all the different people that are involved. So, Jeff, I guess I spoke really quickly, but just in summary again, I kind of gave you an outline of the history of the program. I outlined some of the key elements of success that I believe are what have made this program successful in these different landscapes. And then I provided some examples from across the landscape. There's a lot more going on than what I was able to cover in this amount of time. I will do my best to answer questions that folks might have. But with that, again, it really makes a difference to have people coming together as a thinking community, thinking about birds, thinking about silviculture with birds in mind, and birds with silviculture in mind to advance our goals. So, and here are some key contacts as well. And if you need to reach somebody else, let me know, and I'll try to find their contact info for you. But yeah, Vermont, Steve Hagenboo is a great contact. Amy Tomshaw in North Carolina. Sally is one of my partners in crime in Maine. And I know I'm missing a lot of different states here, but these are some of the key folks. And I know that Minnesota and other states are also building programs as well. So questions or comments? And now I'll try to exit out of this so that I can see all the questions that are coming in. Sound good, Jeff?
Sounds great, Amanda. So I've got a couple teed up for you as usual. First there were some comments, and we always have knowledgeable participants. So Jeff Ritterson from Mass Audubon mentioned on the subject of whether or not how metrics for measuring success. He mentioned there was a 2015 study from Rankin and Perlett, and it was related to forest stand improvement practices. and effects on occupancy and abundance of breeding songbird populations. So that, that's a research study that really looks at the direct effects to birds, but then along the same lines, and there's a question coming after this, Amanda.
Okay.
Mike mentioned as a forester with a bird habitat focus that these programs allow. So he's basically saying, hey, it's get trained up on this stuff because it opens up much more land to foresters for good forest habitat management. So but then along the same lines, a question from Sharon is that there's growing public opposition to forest management. At least she feels this, especially in New England, in New Jersey, in Massachusetts, and Vermont. So I think you explained a lot of ways to combat this, but how would you go about combating that, Amanda?
Boy, that's a bunch of questions. So yeah, New England has a lot going on in terms of opposition. And for folks from other parts of the country, please bear with me. So New England and the Northeast it's the most densely populated region of the country. And we have a lot of private ownerships, and not only private ownerships, but we have a lot of smaller non-industrial private ownerships, which means that there's a lot of people that have a lot of opinions about what happens in the forest. We have, the greater Boston and Hartford and New York City corridors and Philadelphia, and lots of people that live in and around there. And as we know all too well, there are a lot of people that aren't as familiar with how forests work as they are with just how much they enjoy them. So there are a lot of folks that have strong opinions about what should or should not be happening in the forest that they visit. But everyone enjoys forests. Most people seem to enjoy getting to know birds. And so programs like this, Foresters for the Birds and all its different names in different places, are a way to align, are a way to get folks that are less familiar with the benefits of managing forests with birds in mind, with some of those opportunities, and in fact for the responsibility. Under a changing climate, there's been a lot of media attention recently about climate change, and so some folks are saying, well, what about birds? What's that doing to birds, and what can we do to help birds? So then it becomes less about some of the more controversial issues that are popping up in New England right now, like carbon forestry, et cetera. And it becomes more about what's the common ground? What does it look like for us? What do we care about? What can we rally behind? So having a poster child, as it were, of a bird that really tells that story sometimes can get the point across a little bit more effectively than some other outlets. I should say I'm a forester, and I know something like 17 out of 20 foresters might have the same, Myers-Briggs forest type, and introvert is the beginning of it. So we're not necessarily trained in our profession to be out in front of people. I think for foresters and wildlife biologists and for others, like a lot of us got into the profession because we wanted to be alone in the woods, just with the trees and the animals. So having to talk with people, it's unfortunately part of the deal, or fortunately. And we need to communicate that. So tools like Foresters for the Birds help us to communicate the benefits of forest management in different ways than we've had the ability to do so before. So I don't know if that fully addresses the questions that you just raised, Jeff.
I think that was pretty darn good, Amanda. And so here's one you might be able to sink your teeth into a little bit. And so this is from Valerie. And so she's asking about, is there any incorporation of bees and other pollinators along with the avian species concerns into these Forestry for the Birds programs and forestry practices?
Yeah, another great question. And there are so many questions. I'm trying to keep one eyeball on the chat and then the other eyeball on focusing on listening. So I think that in recent years, and again, this Foresters for the Birds was founded in 2008, but it's really been in just the last few years, I want to say, that pollinators have been getting more attention. And pollinators are another great way to engage people, even people that just have backyards and not necessarily woodlands of their own. So depending on where you are geographically, there are some places where there's a natural pairing between existing Foresters for the Birds programs and pollinator discussions. I think just a simple example is, at that workshop, I showed a slide of from the Mahaffey Land Trust in Western Maine. They have a pollinator garden, a really amazing pollinator garden at their conservation center. So they're right there. They're illustrating the benefits of pollinator habitat hand in hand with the benefits of bird-friendly forestry. So I think that depending on where you are, that there's more opportunities to kind of align with those groups. I don't know that there's a specific focus on it. Just as an aside, Maine Audubon is working on forests for fish, and I know Michigan also has a forestry for fish, Foresters for the Fish program as well. So thinking about other species of wildlife that benefit from thoughtful forest management. I think the birds are probably a little cuter than the fish, and that's probably why folks started with birds. But whether you're thinking about pollinators, whether you're thinking about flowers or bees or insects, or thinking about fish or other aquatic invertebrates, then there are other species of wildlife that definitely benefit and can definitely be part of the message behind that.
So great. So here's one that, so you mentioned, this is from Mark Nelson. So you mentioned the National Woodland Owner Survey. And so can you say a little more about that? And, are you working directly with the Forest Inventory and Analysis staff at the U.S. Forest Service related to that?
Yeah, great question. So let's see. So I feel like I've been talking with Brett Butler and his colleagues at the Telly program on and off over the past decade and a half about various woodland owner outreach programs. I know that when Audubon Vermont got started, Telly was still, Tools for Engaging Landowners Effectively was still in its early days. And so I think that there were early conversations and some intentional working with that, but in different states, as the program has evolved and grown, and as it continues to evolve and grow, it kind of depends on who's involved for how closely they look at the National Woodland Owner Survey data. And if Brett is on the line, I apologize if I'm misrepresenting your work, but by understanding from the kind of the survey data, the Telly program kind of put those into different landowner kind of categories or segments or kind of or sort of stereotypes in a way. So you can imagine the working landowner, the landowner who likes being out on the tractor, likes using the chainsaw, likes spending time in the woods. And then there's the woodland retreat owner, the landowner that likes to get out in the woods just to enjoy the peace and the quiet and the tranquility and recreation and snowshoeing and hunting and just being out there and enjoying the woods. Then there's the supplemental income landowner who's only in it for the money, and they have different goals and values. And then there's the unengaged landowner where we really just don't know that much about them. So those National Woodland Owner Survey data for different areas show that a lot of the landowners are sort of a mix between the working landowner and this woodland retreat owner. And so when we're developing Foresters for the Birds as sort of a science-based communication tool about forest management that benefits forest songbirds, then we're thinking about the woodland retreat owner. We can think about the woodland retreat owners that we know. We're thinking about that we're thinking about that working the landowner as well, and thinking about those landowners that we know that really like getting out in the woods. And so kind of where the rubber hits the road for developing, the guidebooks, for developing workshops, at least in Maine, we've been able to hit a sweet spot of kind of catering toward those two audiences based on National Woodland Owner Survey data and from our experience in partnering with different organizations of, who are we speaking to and how do we tailor the message of Foresters for the Birds to these audiences. So hope that helps address your question.
So that was a great answer. And so here's one I think that fits, I think this is a perfect shot for you. So if you're a state without a program, what steps could you take to get one started? And specifically, this is coming from Kendall and this is Southwest Washington. And so, would you work with Western Oregon? And so there was also similar questions from Ohio. How is there anything happening in Ohio now? So I'll let you go.
Yeah. Thanks for those questions. So call me. I'll try to figure out how to type my info in the chat. Let me see, Amanda at forestguild.org. Hopefully that appeared in the chat window, but call me and we can have a conversation. To give some examples from different places, I think, so in Ohio, one place to start would be by figuring out who would be excited about this project. Is it folks that do landowner outreach? Is it a local Audubon chapter or another bird-focused organization? Or is it a land trust? And who are the partners that are excited? And maybe start by figuring out when and where to host a workshop. And I'd be happy to talk with you about how do you put together a workshop that engages different players. Who are the right people to bring to the table? So in Minnesota, for example, a few years ago, my colleague Mike Lynch organized a workshop on Aiken County lands and brought together a whole bunch of different foresters and biologists that at the time didn't talk a whole lot with each other, but really had a good time talking about foresters for the birds and what could that look like in Minnesota. And those conversations are continuing. And now Peter Deezer from the American Bird Conservancy and others are trying to get from idea into action, trying to turn it into a program. But it really helped to start with a field trip, just getting folks together. For Western Washington, again, call me. So I'm tied up with the Forest Stewards Guild is very tied in with that with the Forestry for Oregon birds west side, and I think a lot of the materials that we're developing would dovetail really well with kind of a Western Washington approach, and we can talk about kind of the nuances of the science behind it and how to make the different materials work. But again, workshops, field trips, just getting people together in the woods is a really great place to start. So I hope that helps a little bit.
So Amanda, throughout the questions, there's been a lot of questions about contacts, and a lot of folks have been putting information, and they're brave, and people are putting names and emails and phone numbers in there. So one of the things that I'll remind the participants here that we'll share is Amanda has already said she would go back and help us, and Shannon will help us by clipping all these questions out of the chat. And so what we will do is try to send this information back to you guys within the next week or maybe a couple weeks. So you'll have a pretty good compendium of information that Amanda has given out today, along with some of the research sightings and all that came in here. But I would like to get back to another topical question, Amanda, and I think this is kind of relevant to some of the work groups you and I are on. So the question is from Brenda, and that is, I suspect many landowners are concerned about climate change. How have you integrated carbon sequestration and storage into your guidance?
Really good question. Once again, I'll go back to Audubon, Vermont, and Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation. Let me see. So the Northwood Stewardship Center in Vermont, for instance, has a demonstration forest that is a Forest Stewards Guild model forest, but it's also kind of being managed with climate change in mind. So climate adaptation, and it's being managed with forest songbird habitat in mind. And when you look at it, really bird-friendly forestry is climate-friendly forestry at the crux of it. And Brenda, I know that there are a lot of subtleties and nuances, but again, with intentionality, just overall, if you're thinking about the forest for the birds, and thinking about conserving, older successional forest structures in the places where they're needed most to benefit these different songbirds that really like those diverse forest structures, then you get the carbon benefits as well. Again, I apologize, that's sort of a simplified answer. Carbon is definitely a whole other can of worms, whether you're talking about sequestration or about storage. And what does that look like, and what does it mean? But in the succinct answer, I think, is that bird-friendly forestry really does go hand in hand with carbon storage over time. So I hope that helps a little bit with that question.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And it's a complex topic, and I think we're all struggling with that topic. So this is a question so I'll read this one exactly, because have you seen timber harvesters / foresters actually changing their behavior, harvesting techniques, etc., on their own based on your talks? Or do you find it's still primarily up to the private landowner to direct foresters to conduct operations with birds in mind?
Yeah, so I'm more familiar with the logger outreach in Maine than I am in other states. Usually when I talk with other states about their, working with loggers, then there's not as much of that going on, or it's kind of a newer area for outreach. So in terms of, have loggers change their behavior, I can really only speak to my experience in Maine. I've been to the trainings and presented at logger trainings and they just from their engagement and their interest, they're like, oh, like I guess the goal, like the message with them is that you're already doing a good job, you're already following BMP's best management practices. These are just a few other little tweaks of things that you can do. So it's not asking them to really change, totally change what they're doing. And it's also giving them kind of positive reinforcement that they're already following BMPs, they're already retaining brush, they're already protecting streams, they're already doing a lot that is helpful for forest songbirds. But where we get the ability to change behavior is when they're spending time in the machine, do they want to do they want to like leave a little bit of extra brush? Are they going to instead leave that extra snag where they before might have not even thought about it? We had one logger after a workshop in southern Maine that said, oh, can I put a bird on my business card now? I love this stuff. So so again, getting to how do you measure that change in behavior? I'd have to figure out how do we do that with the folks that participated in a workshop a while ago and then have had time to go and actually implement a timber harvest after a logger training. So yeah, I'd have to think about that. But so loggers and then foresters, I think was the other part of the question. With foresters, it's a little easier because with foresters, there's established communities like the Forest Stewards Guild, like Society of American Foresters, Association of Consulting Foresters. So foresters, as introverted as we are, we still do get together regularly to talk. And also we love attending field workshops to get our CEUs. So there's more opportunities to kind of check in with the forester community and see how people are doing things differently. So I would say that there is change there, and again, quantifying that it's hard to put a number on how many acres or how many trees have been treated differently or looked at differently or marked differently or removed differently because of a workshop. But I guarantee it is happening.
So that's a great segue. That question that Anthony that you just answered, Amanda. It's really a segue to our discussion next month, which is really, webinar 8 on October 19th, and that's about bird conservation on private forest lands. But in this case, we're talking about large managed forest ownerships. And so our speakers are going to be Darren Sleep with the Sustainable Forest Initiative and Darren Miller from Ecology. And so they're going to be talking about things like forest certification and biodiversity conservation, under those circumstances on these large forest ownerships. So that also gets into this. And I will just say from my past experience working with forest certification, when we brought forest certification to our state forests in Maryland, the biggest thing that really changed people's behavior was bringing together the different disciplines, bringing together foresters with ornithologists, with wildlife biologists, with fisheries people, to understand the impacts of logging operations to these headwater streams. And when you had that kind of integration, and then those kind of thoughts were written down into the guidance that was required for these forest certification practices, it really changed people's minds, and those folks began working together with each other on their prescriptions instead of just when they reviewed it at the end of the day. So it really changed how things were done. And so I think you'll hear some of that in next month's presentation, and certainly Amanda has been talking about that throughout this discussion. So Amanda, we're at 2 o'clock. So I think I was just trying to see if there was a perfect question to wrap this with. You did a great job, Amanda, and you really generate a lot of interest from the folks that were out here.
Yeah. Thanks to everybody for participating. And I think that your description of next month's webinar is maybe a good segue to your kind of for winding down, because again, that gets at the thinking community, the people that are making the decisions that affect forest bird conservation on the ground.
Yep. And so Amanda, thanks so much for the presentation. And again, I'll remind everyone, we will be sending out the answers to the other questions we weren't able to get to in the chat. And there were some excellent questions, so thanks for taking the time to answer those. And we'll also be able to provide links and contact information there. So thanks for everyone who stuck with us for this hour and for joining us on at least what's a very beautiful day here in New England. So thank you for everyone, and particular thanks to Amanda Mahaffey of the Forest Stewards Guild. Thanks, Amanda, for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.